When it comes to wine, what do descriptors like musty attic, rotten eggs, and band-aids mean, and how can you avoid them? How do you know if your wine is faulted or you just don't like it? And are there ways you can fix a faulty wine at home rather than having to throw out the bottle or return it? Well, tonight you're going to get those tips and stories and more, and I will introduce my guest momentarily. If you're watching this video on the replay, please, in the comments, type the word replay. Let me know where you're logging in from. What's in your glass, if anything? What's the weather like? And of course, if you're here on the live stream with me, type the same. I want to know, where are you logging in from? I'm Natalie McLean, and I teach popular online wine and food pairing courses, and you've just joined one of the most passionate groups of wine lovers who gather every Wednesday at 7 p.m. to talk to the most interesting people in the world of wine, like our next guest. So I'm live streaming this for the first time on Instagram and YouTube, but it's based on a recorded conversation I had for my podcast, Unreserved Wine Talk. So I'll be here live during the live stream in the comments. So jump in. I want to hear from you. What questions do you have? What stories do you enjoy? And I'll be responding there with you in the comments. So before I introduce our guest, let me say that one of you is going to win a personally signed copy of his amazing book, Wine Faults and Flaws, A Practical Guide. And we're going to ask him more about that in a moment. All you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com and tell me you want to win a copy. I'll choose one person randomly from those who contact me. So, our guest, Keith Grainger, is an award-winning wine writer, educator, and consultant to the wine industry. He is the author of Wine Faults and Flaws, A Practical Guide, which won the coveted 2022 Prix de Louvre, I think. His previous book was Wine Production and Quality, co-authored with Hazel Tattersall, and that won the Gourmand Award for the best wine book in the world for professionals and is mandatory or recommended reading for many wine courses, including university enology programs. And he joins us now about an hour and a half north of his home in London because he's apparently doing some child minding. Welcome, Keith. We're so glad you're here with us.
Hello, Natalie, and hello, everybody.
Yes.
Great to be among some wine lovers.
Excellent. Yes, and I should note that you are not a part-time nanny. You're actually minding your son's children, right?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Can I just add, in addition to the roles which you stated, author,
Yes.
wine writer, I also do consultant winemaking.
Oh.
Used to be in South Africa. I haven't been there since COVID, but still working in Turkey and Cyprus.
Oh, okay. So are you one of those flying winemakers that comes in and advises?
I wouldn't give myself such an illustrious hat. The flying winemakers, tend to spend most of their time on the phone and driving around in their Porsches.
Oh, I see.
I can be quite
No Porsche?
hands-on. Yes, I can be quite hands-on. So I'm not afraid to get dirty and actually to say things as they are rather than as the client might wish them to be.
Excellent. That sounds far more practical. And of course, you're good at finding faults in the first place, so I'm sure your advice would be indispensable. All right, so Let's jump right in, Keith. In a nutshell, what is this Wine Faults and Flaws book about, aside from the obvious, of course? What is it? What makes it different from perhaps anything else that's been written on this topic, and why would we find it useful?
Okay, let me show you the book first of all.
Okay, there it is.
Just
wow,
move it back a
look
bit,
at
so
that.
it should
Yes.
be on the screen.
And
if you like, you can block me out. That's far more attractive.
Those who are listening on the podcast, we will put a link to this in the show notes.
Okay.
And so, yes, how many pages are in there?
528. So
It's a substantial book.
Yeah, pretty big. Weighs well over 1 kilo. It is big. It's available in hardback and as an ebook. It is actually available on Kindle, but why anyone would buy this on Kindle, God only knows. So I'd probably recommend the hardback and maybe even the ebook if you like to search for things.
Sure.
So what's it about? Well, a detailed discussion of wine faults. That's pretty obvious. Mm-hmm. We look at each fault, sort of what it is in basic terms. So a lot of misunderstanding just on the use of words. How you can detect the fault, how you can detect it, the wine into your glass by seeing for some faults, by smelling others, and obviously by tasting for other faults. Some faults you can see, some you can smell, some you can only taste. Also look at how you can detect the fault by laboratory analysis, which probably for our viewers is not that important. But let me say, this book is a bridge between a readable book and a scientific book. Most wine people don't read scientific books. They're too technical, it's hard to understand. Scientists speak their own language all the time, and most scientists don't read wine writers' books. They find them too full of anecdotes, not enough rigour, etc. I've tried to do a bridge between the two, so to do a highly readable book, but something which contains detailed science for those who want it. So for the faults, we look at what stage of production can it occur. Maybe during winemaking, maybe even in the vineyard before the winemaking, sometimes in maturation, sometimes in storage. Look at how the fault might be prevented, and this is of interest even for the wine lover, because poor storage can bring on some faults. Whether a affected wine is treatable by the professionals in the winery or even by the consumer at home. Perhaps a little trick I might give you later on how to treat one of the faults. Yes. I say the detailed science, and really, as someone said, if it's not in this book about wine faults, you probably don't want or need to know.
Oh, that's good. So comprehensive and yet, as you say, readable, and it keeps you going. Because you have some great stories which we're going to dive into. So what drew you to this story? Why wine faults? I mean, in a world of other topics, what intrigued you about this particular area, Keith?
It's funny, just a couple of months ago, a colleague of mine died, a guy called Trevor Elliott, who was a great wine writer and educator. Also author, to my mind, of the best book on the wines of Madeira. That was his area of expertise. But Trevor and I were in Bordeaux, and we're going back now almost 20 years, and we were both together at the same sit-down seminar, presentation, masterclass, whatever we wanted to call it, which was looking at some basic Bordeaux wines that carried the appellation Bordeaux and or Bordeaux Superior. And wines were presented, they were in front of us on the table. When the wines were first poured, we both gave a bit of a look to each other, but when we came to the second wine, picked up the glass and immediately got that nose of mushroom, damp sack, dry rot, all the symptoms of what we normally refer to as corked wine. Trevor and I looked at each other exactly the same time and thought, God, this wine is so badly corked, as we would say, as to be totally undrinkable. So I never like to make a fuss when these things happen. So I just sidled out of my chair, I went up to the front bench where the panel was sitting, and to the maker of the wine and said, "Do you want to have a nose of this?" in my best French, which isn't that great. And he sniffed the wine and said, "C'est parfait, monsieur, pas de problème."
You are wrong.
So I said not a word. I saw the scowls from other tasting participants, but realised, of course, that even professionals often have a lot to learn about wine faults. One of the things that does happen, of course, is winemakers get partially desensitized to certain faults, partial osmotics. It's very tricky. If you're in a cellar that's got a bit of one of the compounds that gives cork taint, TCA, in there, you get used to it and you don't smell it on your wines.
It's like wearing the same perfume too long. You accommodate to it.
You've got it. Yeah. So it's a problem. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Manchuela in Spain. There's an article on my website on this, and I'll say straight away, this was a sponsored visit, so I tried to write positively, but there was one winery I went to which I didn't write about at all. And the organisers came back and said, "Oh, you haven't written about so-and-so and so-and-so." I said, "Yeah," because one step in the building there was haloanesols, the technical name for the cork taint, and if that is in the building, the chances are it's going to get in a lot of the wines, and there's no way I want my readers tasting these faulty wines.
Wow. Yeah. So that's what tipped you in the direction of this book. You wanted
Yeah.
to explore the whole, not just corked, but other types of things when
Yeah.
when bad wine happens to good people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the point is that if you buy a car and there's something wrong with it, you send it back. If it's minor, you try and get it fixed. If it's major, you ask for another car. Anything else, if you buy a TV, a computer or something, and it's substantially faulty, you don't bear with it, you send it back.
Sure.
Now, there's probably a higher incidence of faults in wines than there are in pretty much every other, I'm going to say, consumer good. You know what I mean. A lot of the time people don't know, they don't recognise it. If they do, a lot of the time they think, oh, I'm not going to make a fuss, I'll bear with it. Now, if you're in a wine that's costing, sort of $10, $15 or so a bottle, fine. Okay, that's a small price to pay. But if you're into buying fine wines and it's not right, you are getting ripped off.
Yes. Yeah. Becomes more serious an issue for sure. So what was the story you just told? Was the wine itself faulty, or was there something else at play, perhaps with the stemware?
No, it's definitely the wine that is faulty.
Okay.
We might talk later about issues that there can be with stemware and how it's been washed. But in that case, it was the wine itself, and I did check by tipping into a glass, which I nosed to make sure it was clean, and the fault was well and truly still there.
Okay. So what was the most surprising thing that you discovered while you were writing this book?
I am a practical sort of guy, and I like things to be black and white. And fairly early into my research, I discovered that when it comes to faults, flaws and taints, things aren't always black and white. Let me just at this point, I use the word fault and taint, and I should distinguish between them. Most of us don't. So if a wine's not right, you say it's faulty. Mm-hmm. In theory, if it's something to do with the winemaking, it's a fault. If it's something that's been picked up from elsewhere, it's a taint. So if you get a wine that smells of the stables, the horse manure, etc., or even the Band-Aid, okay, that is something that's been metabolised in the wine by yeast, Brettanomyces, we might get a chance to talk about. On the other hand, a wine that is corked, as we've just been looking at, in fact, it's nothing to do with the wine. The wine picks up the off odours, the off taste from an external source. Now, in the case of the corked wine, it may well be from the cork. It might not be, something else we'll look at, but it's actually nothing to do with the actual wine making. So in theory, we should say that wine's tainted, not faulty. But in practice, we don't. So I, generally speaking, just talk about faulty wines.
Yeah, it's good to know the difference, though.
Yeah, but back to the hardest thing is that the boundary, in many cases, between a wine that's in good condition and one that's faulted is very soft, it's very broad. Now, not in the case of corked wine. And I'm going to say it's probably the last time I'm actually going to use that term. I'm going to say halo anisole tainted. And the reason I'm doing that is because the fault might not be caused by the cork. It could be caused by other factors. But if a wine then is halo anisole tainted, it is always faulty. Doesn't matter what level, it is always faulty. Okay. On the other hand, a wine that shows some signs of Brett aromas, Brett taste, the compounds metabolised by this rogue yeast, Brettanomyces, may or may not be faulty depending on the level of the compounds in the wine. So this one might be acceptable, that one might not be. And the same with some other faults we look at. One we may or may not get a chance to discuss is TDN. When you get that petrol, kerosene, diesel note in a Riesling wine, particularly an aged Riesling, many people regard that as a sign of a good quality wine. But once it goes over a certain boundary, the wine then becomes undrinkable. So a lot of the time it really is a matter of levels of the compounds equals boundaries as we taste the wine.
Right.
And just on this, something else that I learnt as well is that this sounds crazy and it's very rare. Faulty wines can be paradoxically excellent. And
How so? Tell us.
Yeah. I'm going to give an example of a wine I've been fortunate in tasting twice in my life and maybe I'll never taste again. Many people, when they've been asked, I'm talking wine writers, critics, been asked to say, what's the best wine you've ever tasted, the best wine of all time? One wine and vintage comes up quite a few times. It's Chateau Cheval Blanc, 1947. So we're going back a fair few years now.
Yes.
This wine is technically faulty. It's got volatile acidity that is through the roof.
And volatile acidity, how would that smell to the layperson?
Let's just say simply vinegar,
Okay.
or particularly balsamic rather than sort of a spirit vinegar.
Okay.
Now, sometimes, like on an Italian wine, many Italian wines have quite high levels of volatile acidity, and that is part of their Italianness, shall we say. But normally in a Bordeaux, it is well and truly undesirable. So this Cheval Blanc 47 is so complex, it's a wine of the heart, a wine of the soul. But not only has it got volatile acidity through the roof, it's got residual sugar, it's got all sorts of things. If it were made today, the winemaking team would be sacked. There's no doubt about it. They'd be out of the door. So it's very sad to think that, well, many people say the best wine of all time could never be made again. And let me just very quickly give one more example. Nicolas Joly, many of the wine lovers from the Loire Valley know very well. Nicolas Joly is a pretty crazy guy. He's biodynamic. Winemakers and ownologues, tend not to have a kind word to say about him. People who love his wines think he's absolute god. And I'm just going to give a tasting note from Lisa Perotti Brown of the 2005 vintage of Nicolas Joly Clos de la Bergerie Savennier Roche or Moine.
Okay.
And she says, this wine, ethyl acetate, that's a fault. Acetaldehyde, a fault. High volatile acidity, a fault. Along with beautiful, rich, mature fruit. The wine tastes delicious.
Wow. Way to go with the contradictions.
Yes.
Yeah. And he's into, is he also, Nicolas Joly, into natural wines? It's
Yes.
biodynamic, but
Yes.
the whole natural,
Yes.
don't intervene and don't add
exactly.
anything.
He keeps his cell phone well away from his wine.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But it's interesting actually because let me say that my background when I left school is arts. I wanted to be a classical musician and I was pretty damn good in the small town and county where I was brought up. I then went to music college in London and realised that I was crap, that I would never be in the first division. And in classical music, if you're not in the first division, you're not anywhere at all. So I had the good sense to say, right, let's not pursue this. Although I did spend a few years in record production on pop music of all things. But just going forward from that, I learnt my science as I started learning my wine. So many winemakers, oenologues, their background is a first-class honours degree in organic chemistry. Mine isn't. I had to learn all that as I went along, did lots of courses, but because in many ways I regard myself as an artist, I look at wine from an artist's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when we look at these faults again, scientists can pinpoint it down to the numbers, the compounds, etc. To the wine lover, in some ways that's unimportant. It's how the wine tastes in the glass.
Yes.
Is it actually enjoyable?
The whole
So
picture.
when we come to people like Nicolas Joly, and his biodynamics and his craziness, the scientists, i.e. the people who got their first class honours degree and the PhD in various aspects of organic chemistry, they will poo-poo all this natural wine. So will the botanists. They will poo-poo biodynamics. There's a quite interesting book by a professor of viticulture at UC Davis, Mark Matthews, called Terroir and Other Myths of Wine Growing. And Mark dismisses biodynamic in about half a page,
Wow.
because
What's his issue with it?
it's not scientific.
Oh, I see.
To put
Okay.
it very, very simple. And of course, Mark actually dismisses in not quite so few words, the whole concept of terroir, soil, minerality coming into wines. And I'm just putting this in a very, very quick précis. But what I'm trying to say is that, so he would dismiss biodynamics, he would dismiss Nicolas Joly, but you cannot argue that biodynamics it can produce stunning wines. Domaine de la Romani Conti, Domaine Loire, Chateau Pontet Canet in Bordeaux, Chapoutier, the Rhône, go on and on and on. Yes. So just because it can't be explained by science, to my mind, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
Exactly, and even if it's not the actual bearing of the bull's horns and the chamomile tea, at least the winemaker is paying close attention to those vines through all of the biodynamic practices and getting away from, herbicides.
Yeah,
pesticides.
I agree, spot on.
Yeah.
I'd often question, is this wine great because A, it's biodynamic, or B, because of the attention to detail that the winemakers make. I will say, just going back to our friend Nicolas Joly in the Loire, he once said to me, and I'm paraphrasing slightly here, Keith, he says, you talk about winemaker. I don't know the meaning of the word. What is a winemaker? The wine is made in the vineyard, and all we do is convert that into something that is delicious.
Yep, another sort of zealous,
Yes.
not zealot, but zealous pronouncement. So what is the weirdest wine fault you've ever heard of, or that we've not heard of, that would surprise us?
Right, I'm not going to try and be technical. It always shut me up when I get technical. It's probably the fault of mousiness. Mousiness, which is a lactic acid fault. I'm not going to pronounce the chemical compound responsible. I'm just going to give you the acronym, which is ATHP, and another one ETHP. But mousiness is a very strange one because you don't normally pick it up when you're smelling it, or smelling the wine. It manifests itself on the palate, and particularly the back palate. So what I'm saying is the compounds responsible are not volatile, not ones you normally smell, but you get it after the wine's been swallowed or after it's been spat, and the saliva in the mouth has diluted the acid of the wine and therefore raised the pH. And the flavours, mouse urine, now we're not normally used to tasting that. I've got a house in France. It's an old, what they call cour de ferme, the heart of a farm. We've always got mice. I try to keep the house as clean as possible, but we're in the country and mice get in, full stop. So you learn that mouse smell pretty quickly, that smell of a dirty mouse cage. The nearest we get in something which we're perhaps used to tasting is popcorn. So particularly noticeable on the back palate, on the finish of the wine. Sometimes get a bit of a hint of dried sausage skins, salami, sometimes a bit of a hint of vomit, or even just dirty kitchen mops. So quite a few ways it can manifest itself.
So unappetizing. This is another reason why we are not tasting wines today. We can't have this whole discussion and then, let's turn to... wow, those are very unusual kinds of aromas. Thank God they're not prevalent, or at least as prevalent as, say, TCA fault.
Yes.
So can we generalize a bit? Can faults sort of fall into two categories, those that are caused by bacteria versus those that are caused by sulfur compounds?
Not quite that simple, actually, but you're on the right track. Okay. Sulfur we know as a chemical, so let's include the faults caused by sulfur compounds as chemical faults. Bacteria, of course, are in the realms of microbiology, so let's say we've got chemical faults and microbiological faults. One other thing we can get, of course, is a physical fault, i.e. That's something quite simple. If you were to open a wine and you find there's some contamination in there, an insect's got in, or some bits of grit or treading bits of glass or something. That's something I don't really discuss in the book in any depth, because you can find that in any food industry. One of the commonest causes of food products being recalled is contamination with something, oil from machines or something like that. But when it comes to the wine itself, chemical or microbiological.
Okay. And are inexpensive wines, say, let's just have an arbitrary cutoff, under $20, are they more prone to having faults in general than expensive wines?
No, if
No?
anything, I say it's the other way around.
Huh.
The reason is quite simple. Inexpensive wines, and I've got nothing against them, drink them quite often, are what I will call factory wines, generally speaking. The economics are not there for them to be produced by an artisan, by a small producer.
Okay.
So factory wines, normally the winery, wine factory, whatever you want to call it, is pretty well equipped. Quite often they've got their own laboratory, they've got their own technicians on hand, and they are testing, checking the wines all the time. So in fact, faulty wines are more likely to be found in high-end wines, artisan wines, especially when people want to do wine as natural as possible, or not use the word natural wine just for a minute, but let's say keep sulfur dioxide levels as low as possible, perhaps not filtering the wine. Now, Robert Parker, of course, was always totally adverse to wine filtration, felt that it's very detrimental to quality. I would probably agree with him, but not in all circumstances. But many potential hazards, potential faults, can be excluded by fine filtration. So Britannomyces, as we mentioned already, probably look at again, is something which, if you filter the wine through a sterile filter, the fault is much less likely to happen.
Ah, okay, I didn't know that. Wow. So let's go back to the whole, I'm going to call it corked because I cannot pronounce what you're saying. But you can talk your language, I'll talk mine. So it's correct if anything is wrong here, but it's when a fungus interacts with the chemical used to sanitize corks and produces the chemical TCA, the acronym for 2,4,6-trichloro. Yeah, I should not try. But as you said, we can recognize corked wines by their musty, mildewy. I always think of an old attic aroma and flavor. Is it Is it true that about 5% of bottles are corked?
Okay, let me answer that question first, and then I'll come back to your introduction.
Definition, my faulty definition.
Exactly. I know, so, 5%. That probably was the case in the 1990s, and maybe even in the early 2000s.
Okay.
Not so now. There was a huge so-called cork taint crisis in the 1990s, and the cork industry realised it really had to get its act together because it was losing the market. So particularly Australia and New Zealand, the producers say, hang on a minute, if we're getting far too many dodgy corks from you guys, we're going to turn to alternative closures. Many producers initially went on to synthetic cork-like stoppers, so-called Supreme Cork, but particularly in Australia and New Zealand, they went on to screw cap. So the cork industry had perhaps been a little bit arrogant during the 1990s. People have to buy cork to close their wine. Then it was realised they didn't. So they started getting their act together, and a huge investment in R&D since then, absolutely massive. So I would say today the incidence of cork wines is probably more like 0.5%, but it does vary from country to country, region to region, and in some cases, yes, there is a high incidence, but even 0.5% is too high. I mean, the aim is to get it down to zero, obviously. But let me just go back to your introduction as to how the taint is caused. Is caused. That was a nice slip of the tongue. I'm going to say straight away, you would probably never have found a corked wine, as we refer to it today, before the Second World War. Now, people wrote about corked wine. There's a famous English writer called George Saintsbury, who did a book called Notes on a Cellar Book in the 1920s, and he refers to a wine being corked. But what he was referring to is pretty definitely not what we think of the corked wine today, that musty taint, that dry rot, mushrooms, damp sack, etc. It was probably something else in the cork. Because the cork problem and cork taint problem started just after the Second World War, and we can blame our friends in the agrochemical, petrochemical industry. They started manufacturing pesticides and herbicides that were based on chlorophenols. We don't need to know what they are particularly, but also bromophenols. Think of chlorine for chlorophenol and bromine for bromophenol.
Okay.
These herbicides, pesticides start getting made. Dow, Monsanto were manufacturing. Now, let us not put blame here for a minute. Let's say quite often people first move into something, they don't know the problems that will ensue in years' time.
Yeah.
But what happened then is that chlorophenols and bromophenols became airborne. Chlorophenol, by the action of fungi, particularly filamentous fungi, those things that throw out little filaments, those fungi will convert chlorophenol into chloroanisole, your TCA, and bromophenol into bromoanisole, so-called TBA. Now, that started getting, as I say, airborne. The trees in the cork forests in Portugal and Spain, they were picking up the chlorophenols. The fungi in the bark would convert it into chloroanisoles, and thus the problem really got going. It was getting larger and larger from the 1970s, 80s, and probably peaked in the 1990s. Now, the cork industry's changed its practices, well overdue, so a lot of research. The top-end cork producers now have processes that can guarantee that there is no detectable TCA in the cork. I do say detectable because it can be there below detection threshold, and they actually give the wineries who buy corks on them that guarantee. The problem with that, of course, is those corks cost a fortune, and you're not going to get them, as you say, your $15 bottle of wine, because the cork itself costs over $1.
Oh, okay. Wow, interesting.
So that's the background.
Yeah.
So one thing to consider just here then is that if the compounds are present in the cork, they can migrate into the wine.
Right.
But you can get so-called cork wines, back to my haloanisole word, that have never seen a cork in the bottle. Where I was in Bordeaux when my colleague and I were tasting these wines, it probably wasn't a cork problem. It almost certainly was a winery problem. I say that because I actually visited the property in question a year later, walked through the door and, oh yes, I remember
Could
that
smell
wine.
it.
Yes, straight there.
Wow.
Now, I want to just look briefly at two areas. California, very familiar to you, and Bordeaux, very familiar to me. During the 1960s, 70s, Bordeaux was starting to pick itself up after World War II. 61 was a great vintage, 66 was pretty good. 82, of course, if we go forward a bit, fantastic vintage. Lots of wineries started reinvesting. The buildings had been crumbling, they were not in the best of states, which in some ways you think is not good. But it turned out that the reinvestment wasn't good, because quite often they were having lots of the timber work taken out and new timber put in.
Okay.
The timbers were treated with bromophenols, back to where I was. So immediately then these start getting converted by filamentous fungi and come into the wines. And I think I can name these without any risk of you or I getting sued. There were some big problems in Bordeaux in the late 1980s, early 90s. Chateau du Cru Bacayou, for example, the contamination of their chai, their cellar, was so bad they had to have it pulled down and entirely rebuilt.
Wow.
There are problems with Chateau Canon, Chateau Latour, etc. Big problems. And one of the things with Bordeaux as well, the way the system works, is that they were, and still are to a degree, detached from the market. The wines would be sold by brokers into what's called the Place de Bordeaux. In other words, they would never see a customer. And it's only when people started writing about things and reports start getting back, and they shrug their shoulders, of course, and pas de problème, monsieur, again. But when person after person started saying this, that they started to act. Now, of course, it wasn't just Bordeaux, many other wine regions, and California, number sellers suffered in the 1990s, Hansel, Heinz, and not that long after they did so well in the Judgment of Paris, Chateau Montelena had big problems with TCA contamination. These were picked up by some writers, initially dismissed, but when the technical team went to the cellars, they found the problems. So then they had to start taking out woodwork, shaving off barrels, all sorts of things. And I must say, California generally today is pretty clean. And all the wineries I've mentioned, I must say once again, they are ultra clean cellars and back in top form.
Well, that's a good thing. Wow. So although the incidence of corked bottles has diminished, I think you were talking in another interview where it was either corked wines or all faulted wines. You estimate it could be costing the industry anywhere from $1 billion to $10 billion. What was that about?
The 10 billion figure is spread over a number of years, actually.
Okay.
And it's from research papers. In fact, that's spread over 8 years and going back a few years. But even today, researchers on behalf of the European Union estimate that the haloanisole contamination, the corked wines, is probably costing 700 million euros a year. So trying to think what that figure
over
is
$1 billion, yeah,
exactly.
Sure,
Yeah.
when you translate it,
Yeah,
absolutely. And I found it fascinating because you made some analogies that how minuscule amount of quirkiness it takes to ruin a wine. So one was about wheat. What was that analogy?
Okay, just the scientific 5 seconds before we go into that. For a corked wine, the compound are so volatile that a tiny amount, i.e. just over 1 part per trillion, will have a tainted wine that you can taste. So my analogy back to wheat is that would be the equivalent of 1 grain of wheat in 100,000 tonnes, or 1 cube of sugar in 60 Olympic-sized swimming pools.
Wow.
It's been estimated, not by me, that a couple of tablespoonful of this taint is enough to cause a problem in all the wines in the world.
Yes. Oh my goodness, that's incredible. Wow. And yet you add too that cork can absorb some of the bad smell. So does that help, or is it still masking the problem in not a good way?
This is interesting. I'm reasonably friendly with some of the technical guys at Amarim, who are the largest cork producer in the world. I'd say reasonably friendly. Obviously, when I've been doing research, you've got to get into these guys so you can understand the way they work. And Paolo Lopez, technical director, always says that servers, waiters, sommeliers, when drawing the cork from a bottle, will often smell the cork. And if the wine smells at all musty or taint, they will reject the wine. But it can be that the wine itself was cork tainted, but the cork has absorbed the taint from the wine. So it's like a blotting paper.
Right.
So what we normally look at is you need to sort of dissect the entire cork. If it smells musty at the wine end, it's probably come from the wine. If it smells musty through the cork or even at the top end away from the wine, it's probably been a cork problem. That's been ultra simplistic.
Sure. And do screw caps eliminate your risk of your wine being corked? I guess you said it can come from other sources, so not, right?
They substantially reduce the risk, there's no doubt. But yes, if it's present in the wine, so it's come from a contaminated winery, you can still get it. And I've found numerous incidences of wine sealed with a screw cap, which have got the haloanisole taint in there.
Right. And you've talked about this, and as have I in the past. And, a corked wine is so damaging to a winery's reputation because someone who doesn't know the wine can open it. It smells like a musty attic, and they think, I just don't like this wine. They're not a good winemaker. So how can we tell when a wine is mildly corked and just sort of depressing the aromas a bit, because it is on a spectrum, versus this wine just isn't really aromatic or doing much?
Okay, first of all, the damage to reputation can be very real.
Yes.
And of course, your eye, and I'm sure most of your listeners would better say straight away if the wine is so-called corked. But the general consumer, they may think, I don't like this wine. This is a rubbish wine. This is a cracked wine. I'm not going to buy any more of this bottle, or I'm not going to buy any more from this producer even.
Right.
And if Imagine how cheated you feel when you've got wines in your cellar you've been carefully nurturing for the last 15, 20 years maybe, and you open the bottle, it's cold. You think, excuse me, bugger me, but
never again.
Never
Exactly.
again, exactly. So the damage that can be done, and I suppose as with all faults, especially today, with podcasts, blogs, etc. Nothing is talked about as much as wine. There's no other food product, no other drink that is discussed quite as much as wine. So the word gets round in seconds.
It's quite the grapevine.
Yeah, there's a problem here. But to the other part of your question, though, how do you know if it's a low-level taint? Well, sometimes you don't. These TCA compounds and TBA compound, if it affects a wine at a very low level, you don't get the mustiness, you don't get the damp sack, you don't get the mushrooms, you don't get the dry rot. But the wine will taste flat, as though somebody's been sucking all the aromas, all the flavours out of the wine. And this, of course, is a big problem to the industry, because if it's a high level taint, then people may well complain. But if it's a low level, then almost everyone is just saying, oh, nothing much of this wine, it is under delivering well and truly. So that is when they really fear the problem. And back to my friends at Ameren again, they do say that the TCA problem is not going to go away, but as far as cork's concerned, the problem is getting diminished, but the problem is always there through aerial contamination. And let me just say, it's not just wine it affects, so many other things. It affects water, it affects...
Tap water. How does it affect tap water? Your water will taste like a musty attic?
Spot on. Two things there to consider. Firstly, of course, that tap water is very often chlorinated. Chlorine, of course, back to my chlorophenol, is one of the sources of TCA. Back to my little visit to the winery in Spain just a few weeks ago. As soon as I walked in through the door, not only did I smell mustiness, I smelled chlorine, which they were using as a cleaner. A winery should never, ever, ever use chlorine as a cleaner. Big mistake. So it can get in the water from chlorine, water being chlorinated, but also, of course, more and more nowadays, water comes through plastic pipes. Plastic, of course, have got phenols in, so once again, the contamination can come from the pipes. It is a growing problem.
Wow, that's fascinating. And speaking of water and so on, there was another story of an expert tasting a wine, and at first he thought it was corked, but what was happening really?
That was me and a colleague. Another one is sadly no longer with us. Had a few people die in the last year, very sadly. We're at the wine fair in London and tasting wines from Western Australia with a great winemaker called Larry Cherubino. And Larry makes wines under his own label. He also makes them under the Robert Oatley label. And a colleague of mine tasted the wine, Richard Boss, excellent wine taster, picked up the wine, immediately passed it back to Larry, said, Larry, this wine's tainted. I picked up mine, immediately thought the wine was tainted. Then I picked up a clean glass off the table, which was also tainted. The glasses had been washed in London tap water, and that put the taint into the wine.
The taint. Oh my goodness. And I think that is why it's good, not snooty recommendation, to smell your glass in a restaurant before they even pour the wine. I do. And, some people think, oh, that's what the cool kids do, but that's practical reason why to do that.
And you often get that sort of wet glass cloth, dishcloth nose as well. Nothing to do with corkiness. And straight away think, oh God, this wine smells off, but it's just the dirty glass.
Exactly, or detergent, which is going to not be a friend to wine. So how do you handle, this is more like social advice, or you believe your wine is corked, or it is, and you're in a restaurant. How do you gracefully send the bottle back? What do you say? How do you handle it?
Oh, well, of course, I'm the most antisocial social person you'll meet. But
say, no.
Exactly. Send it back and mention my name. No, I think what you do, I say, remember that the wine is not fit for purpose. And I personally would say, I very rarely send a wine back, but this one's really undrinkable. You know, it really is faulty.
Yeah. Yeah, I probably defer a little too much because I am a so-called wine expert, but I will get the server sometimes to say, or could you smell this wine? And often they'll pick it up right away, and then I'm sort of in collusion with them saying, oh yeah, it's a bad bottle. But I mean, I would push the point if they said, nope, pas de problème, madame.
Yeah, exactly. Just say you're an influencer, you know, it's the usual way. But one point I will just make back to the halo aerosol, the cork taint. In sparkling wines, it's detectable at a really, really low level. And I gave my grain of wheat, you know, but we're looking at a tenth of a grain of wheat. And therefore, you're far more likely to notice it on sparkling wines. But once again, never think twice about sending them back, because sparkling wines are so delicate. They have any hint.
And why does it come? Why is it more detectable in a sparkling wine?
Probably simply because the way the aromas are working, the way the fizz is making all the aromas more volatile, so you get it quite quickly. Here's a little hint at home. If in any doubt, if the wine is, I'll use the word corked again, pour some into another glass and add about twice the amount of mineral water, not tap water, just still mineral water. If the aroma is the same or greater, it is the corkiness halo aerosol problem. If it's diminished, it is not. It is something else.
Neat little science trick. Yes, as long as it's not Chateau Margaux or something.
Exactly.
Watering down. So too much oxygen is also the enemy of wine, as it is to a lot of other substances. Air makes nails rust, fruit turn brown. Wine tastes stale and turn a deep yellowish or brownish color. Oxidized wine is another sort of bacterially related fault, or it's a fault, right? Not a taint?
Let me say straight away, it can be chemical, it can be enzymes, and on some occasions it can be bacterial. Chemical oxidation is the most likely you'll find. I'm not going to distinguish between these today.
Sure. Thank you. No, I understand, and not to dismiss the science, but yes, just to some more generalizations that we can keep in mind. So does it occur mostly, oxidized wine, when the wine is being made because it's been overexposed to air during the winemaking process or the aging or at some point?
Yeah. Can occur at any stage of winemaking.
Okay.
More likely is if the winery team have been careless and they've had vats that have not been completely full. There's been some oxygen, some air on top of the vat, and then the wine will oxidise. The same can happen in barrels. Now, barrel maturation is, of course, a controlled oxygenation. Shouldn't really use the word oxidation on this. But once again, if the barrels are not topped up properly, then oxidation can occur. Can occur in storage if the wine's been stored badly.
Okay. And so what does oxidized wine taste or smell like?
At a low stage, it can just smell a bit of a bruised apple. When it starts getting more heavily oxidized, you start getting dried fruit coming into it, bitterness. You start getting those what I call sherry-like noses, even if the wine's not an Oloroso sherry. And if you taste the wine, it's bitter, it is dried out. And sometimes when wines have got oxidation, they can also become very vegetal, so very cabbagey, Brussels sprout.
Yeah, not at all appealing. And yet, you mentioned sherry. I don't know if it's correct to say, but the oxidized taste is part of the wine's desirable character. Of course, it has other fine characteristics. But what is going on with sherry? Why is it a good thing in sherry?
Well, there's two different types of, or I should say, methods of aging sherry. One of which is the biological aging, which is what happens with Fino, sherry, Manfiniere, etc., where the wine is being aged under a crust of yeast, the floor yeast, which keeps a lot of the oxidation at bay. It does let a little bit through, so we start getting this compound called acetaldehyde. So that Fino sherry nose is acetaldehyde. But the Oloroso type of sherry tend to be deeper in colour. They've been deliberately aged in butts that are not completely full, so allowed to oxidise. Now you need a wine of the right structure for this to be beneficial. So if this were to happen on a Muscadet, for example, or Sauvignon Blanc, then it would always be damaging. But if it happens on a wine with the right structure, then it can be beneficial.
Okay. And then similarly, there's another fault, the reduced wine. There's an absence of oxygen, smells like stagnant water or something decomposing. Can racking, moving the wine from one barrel to another in the winery, fix this problem? Or what about letting the wine breathe in the glass at home?
Yeah, okay. Firstly, letting the wine breathe in the glass can be very beneficial. You need to really swirl it round and round quite a bit and probably leave it for a bit of a while. The aromas of reduction are very vast. Wine can smell of drains if the problem is hydrogen sulfide, that bad egg nose. That one is so easy to pick up. Do remember that hydrogen sulfide is a poisonous gas. But the wine can smell of garlic, can smell of onion. If you've ever smelt a skunk, you probably never want to smell one again. But those can be the noses of reduction. It's a very complex process, once again. Wines sealed with a screw cap are more likely to show what is called post-bottling reduction. And it's perhaps worth looking inside your screw caps, because the seal isn't, of course, the screw part of the cap. It is the liner inside. And you get two different types of liner. One that's normally silver in colour, which is what is called a sarin tin liner. And that will let no oxygen at all into the wine. Another one is what is called a Saranex liner, and those normally look a little bit like white plastic inside. That will allow a limited amount of oxygen in. But certainly, since the advent of screw caps, many producers have been having to change their winemaking, change how much sulfur dioxide they're adding to the wine to fit the closure. Now, I don't think that's a good thing. I think the closure should fit the wine and not the winemaking the other way round. There is a producer of synthetic closures called Noma Cork, who make closures with different oxygen transmission rates, and the winery can choose which type they want, how much oxygen they want to get into the wine. And just one little hint here, people often think that wine, if it's sealed with a cork, it sort of breathes through the cork. It doesn't. Any oxygen that comes into the wine was actually contained in the cork in the first place and gets slowly released into the wine.
I didn't know that. Wow, very cool. I love these science nerdy things. And so screw caps, it's better if there's generally a the white sort of capsule
not necessarily.
Okay.
As we all know, this is not black and white where is the boundary. Screw caps are great on some wines, they're not so good on other wines. But a wine with a short shelf life, and I'm talking, for example, a Sauvignon Blanc, generally speaking, people will drink within 2 years or so of the harvest. The Saranex, the white liner, can be very, very good. Something that's going to be kept for longer, probably the sarin tin liner. That is ultra simplistic, and if any of your listeners are in the closure industry, they're probably going to tear me apart and try to be so simple.
They can get your book and realize that there's more depth, of course, behind your answers. But what would be the difference between reduced and Maderized wine?
They're at the other end of the spectrum. Maderized is oxidized at its worst. So reduced is completely the other end. Although sometimes, paradoxically, you can get some similar notes coming out. Maderized wine, I say, will smell of sherry, might smell of nuts, might smell of curry, but certainly might smell rancid. And sometimes, of course, heavily reduced wines can smell rancid as well. So, but technically speaking, other ends of the spectrum.
Okay. And is Maderized wine, when it's faulted like that, does it also smell like cooked or old?
Yes.
Or
Yes,
Achieved,
yeah.
okay.
Of course, when making Madeira, Madeiras go through the Estufa process where the wines are deliberately heated up.
Yeah.
But while you're talking about cooked, say some problems are on the increase, and heat damaged wine, which can become Madeirized wine, is a problem. And that certainly is when the wine tastes cooked. You can often tell it if a wine's sealed with a cork. If the cork seems slightly raised in the bottle, the wine's probably got too hot at some point in its life cycle. Most likely when it's been shipped, sitting on the dockside or in the containers on the ship. And in these days when everyone's trying to save energy and fuel, ships in many cases are getting cooler, people aren't paying for air-conditioned containers. The wine can actually get up to 40 degrees C in
Wow.
those containers, so well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
Oh my goodness. And so, could leaving a wine in your trunk of your car on a hot summer's day Maderize it? Would it happen that quickly?
Just ask my principal in Cyprus.
Okay.
Distributing wine in Cyprus is not so easy, and quite often the salespeople who are not only selling the wine, they're also delivering the wine, will pick it up one day, leave it in the car, i.e. pick it up on a Friday for delivery on Monday.
Oh. And then
Yeah.
it's cooked?
Yeah, that is
could be?
cooked well and truly,
Okay.
well and
Oh.
truly. And then of course
Right.
no one blames the delivery guy, they all blame the winery.
Of course. So, and just to go back, you mentioned Madeira. So that's the fortified wine from southwest Portugal, an island
Yeah.
that's purposely cooked
Yeah.
3 to 6 times. So why, again, like sherry, why is this desirable in Madeira and not in other wines?
It's down to the structure of the wine,
Of
really.
the wine again, okay, yeah.
Madeira, say this volcanic island, just off. Well, in fact, it's nearer Africa than Portugal, although it's owned by Portugal. But these are these big, heavy, structured wines. In fact, the idea of cooking the wine came by accident, of course, when the ships were getting becalmed in the sun. Nobody like us talking about the heat damage, and paradoxically, they found the wine was better at the destination than when it had left the departure port.
Fascinating. And let's go back to Brettanomyces, which is part of the yeast family and often referred to as the cool kids by Brett. Can make some wines smell like barnyard. You quoted someone as saying grape burgundy should smell like
Shit. Yes. That is not my quote. I take
right.
no
You were quoting
responsibility.
somebody.
Yeah, I was quoting Anthony Hansen, who's a great Burgundy expert, and in the first edition of his book on Burgundy in 1982, he said Great Burgundy smells of shit. By the time he got to the second edition, he realised that wasn't really the case, and that the wines had been in factories were not contaminated, because this is made within the wine by the actions of this rogue yeast, Brettanomyces.
Huh. And so, but still, today, some people consider that barnyard, euphemistically, the barnyard smell in Burgundy desirable. So what is it? Is it just a preference, or is this truly a fault or a taint or whatever?
It depends where you're coming from.
Okay.
A number of my colleagues say I meaning they are an objective taster. Keith Grainger, I am not an objective taster, I am a subjective taster, because we cannot be objective. It's like trying to be honest. We strive to be, but we cannot be. We're influenced by culture, by education, by training, where we come from, what we've grown up with, you name it. So to a new world winemaker, Brettanomyces, generally speaking, is a major, major fault, be they from Australia, New Zealand, California. To someone in France, and let me use the Rhone Valley as an example, where lots of the wines showed the compounds of Brettanomyces, it is part of the terroir. It is what is making this wine individual. So there is no black or white, except to say, to my mind, a little bit adds a bit of spice, a little bit of, how should we put it, a little bit of edginess, makes the wine a little bit different. A lot makes the wine undrinkable.
Sure.
Back to my boundary challenge.
Absolutely. And that is the case with a lot of things. Like a little bit of oak might be nice, but a lot of oak can mask the actual wine itself.
The best analogy I can give is like watching a comedian. And this comedian is very risque and is going very near the line. It's highly amusing. And then they go over the line and they just become crude.
Very good analogy. Love it. Excellent. Now, a lot of people are concerned about sulfites. They think they're allergic to them and so on. This is the preservative sulfur dioxide, or SO2, that's added to wine to give it a longer shelf life. And just so listeners know, sulfites exist in nature and are in all wines. Even if it says no sulfites added, it's still
Correct.
there. But in large amounts, of course, it can smell like rotten eggs. But should people worry about sulfites as much as they do?
Okay, first thing, just I need to distinguish between the nose of excess sulfur dioxide and sulfites and the reduced wine, which are volatile sulfur compounds. So once again, today I'm not going to go into the whys and wherefores, but if a wine smells of rotten eggs, it's got volatile sulfur compounds, it is reduced. If it smells of sulfur, that's like striking a match. Or do you remember when I'm not sure they still do in Canada, roast chestnuts on the coke brazier in the street. That smell of burning coke, that is excess sulfur dioxide. Now that is sloppy winemaking, there is no doubt about it. The amount of sulfur dioxide that can go into any wine is regulated by law in every major market. The actual technical amount can vary a little bit from market to market, but it is regulated. And the amount that's in wine tends to be less than many other things people eat or drink without thinking about it. Orange juice can have sulfites added. Dried fruits, sultanas, raisins, etc. can
And
have
I've heard that like how do they compare it? A glass of orange juice has more sulfites in it than a whole entire bottle of wine.
It can do.
Okay.
So, should people be worried? Firstly, if you suffer from asthma, the answer is definitely yes, because you can have problems. Generally speaking, authorities are trying to reduce the amount of sulphur in wine, and the limits get reduced every decade or two. But I'm going to now fall out with the natural wine people and say that sulfur is the great antioxidant, we discuss oxidation, but antimicrobial agent as well. But the hard thing is that of all the sulfur dioxide that added to the wine, only part of it acts as an antioxidant, part called the free sulfur dioxide, and only a part of that acts as an antimicrobial agent. Now, this is starting to get very, very tricky, but people can say, I've reduced my sulphur, and they can have still quite relatively high levels of free sulfur dioxide. On the other hand, someone can say, I've got high sulfur levels, I'm trying to reduce it, but they got low levels of free sulfur dioxide. So it is very, very tricky.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've heard, I don't know, estimates that only really less than 5% of the population truly has an allergy to sulfites.
Yeah, it's probably more like 1%, but I'm not a medical person, so I would not want to be quoted on that. Just one thing before we leave the sulphur though. So the part that is antimicrobial is what is called the molecular sulfur dioxide, and the amount that works will depend on the pH, that is called the acidity of the wine. So if you want to make a wine the way you can reduce sulphur, you need to keep your acid levels fairly high and your pH levels fairly low.
Because acid's a natural preservative, so high acid wines will be less likely to be prone to those issues, but also need less sulfites.
Yeah, I remember quite recently I found a 1987 Riesling Cabinet from a friend of mine in Germany, and 87 wasn't a great year. This wine I just hidden away. I brought it out, thought this was going to be shot to pieces, but because it wasn't a very ripe vintage, the acid levels were through the roof. The wine was wonderful.
Oh, that's great. That's great. A happy cellar discovery. But are people usually reacting to histamines in wine when they get that headache? I mean, too much wine, period, causes a headache. So let's just be honest about that. But is it more of a histamine reaction than the sulfites?
alcohol causes problems. Sulfites can cause a problem, but biogenic amines, of which histamine is the most important, definitely can cause problems as well. So all of them.
Okay, and where did the histamines come from in wine? Is it
Okay.
where do they stem from?
Okay, but this once again we are getting very, very technical. We are looking at actions of lactic acid bacteria on amino acids in the wine, but I can't explain that in simple. I'm very careful to say that there's one of my colleagues always says, "Oh, it's all too technical. You want to understand." I think sometimes you don't need to understand. Just have the basic. A computer works because it works.
Sure, just turn it on.
Yeah.
But are there certain wines that are tend to have more histamines than others? Like people are asking me all the time, like, I get these headaches, what can I avoid or what can I steer clear of to maybe reduce?
Lots of sparkling wines can have quite high histamine levels.
Okay.
Definitely Proseccos and champagnes, etc. But there are many, many others. It's one of the areas where the industry is trying to move forward, because the health risks from wine aren't just from alcohol, there are other things as well.
Okay. And you mentioned Band-Aids before. Where does that come from, or what is that?
Sorry, mentioned?
Band-Aids?
Oh,
The
Band-Aid.
smell of Band-Aids,
yeah. This is another of the Brett compounds. So the barnyard is one, but
Yep.
there's a compound called 4-ethylphenol that gives the Band-Aid. Now, what is interesting is that both the barnyard compound, which is 4-ethyl-guaiacol, and the Band-Aid compound, 4-ethylphenol, are often present but in different proportions. In wine, normally quite a high level of 4-ethylphenol. But beer, I love my beers as well, my craft beers. Some brewers actually love Britannomyces beers, some of the lambic brewers from Belgium, for example, and even some eclectical Californian brewers. But the compound then tends to be more the 4-ethyl-guaiacol, so you don't get that Band-Aid aroma on the beers.
Okay. Now, you've written about light strike. It's on your website right now as well. It's really interesting. It can affect wines bottled in clear glass because they only filter out 10% of UVA, those damaging light, versus green bottles filter 50 to 90%, brown bottles maybe 90 to 99%.
You've done your homework.
Yes, well, but yeah, I wanted to. I feel like I'm in science class again in a good way. And it's more likely to affect sparkling wines, white and rosé,
Yes.
whereas red are more protected by their own color compounds or phenols.
Phenols, yeah.
So what does light strike smell like or look like?
Back to our reduced compounds, because it's
Okay.
very closely related to reduced compounds. Skunk, garlic, cooked cabbage, Marmite sometimes. I will say straight away it's one of the growing faults today. A number of faults are in decline, so the corkiness, the haloanisole is in decline, but
Okay.
light strike is on the increase. Number of restaurants are going to, they've got the ultraviolet light there, and their bottles of sparkling wine, champagne in clear glass sitting under the light. White wines can be affected and sparkling wines can be affected after 8 minutes under an ultraviolet light.
Really?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Yeah, they usually have these out on display, or you'll see glass racks as you walk into the restaurant. It looks
Yeah.
beautiful, but it's
Yeah.
not so good for the wines.
So,
Yeah.
some champagne producers who like to put their wines in clear glass use a cellophane wrap, a coloured cellophane wrap, which should not be taken off on any circumstances until the bottle's correct.
And Louis Roederer being the most famous one with
Yes.
Cristal, right?
Exactly, yeah. So otherwise you're going to get this horrible, say, reduced dimethyl sulfide aromas. A number of champagne producers are actually moving back to coloured glass, in fact, for their rosés. Doesn't look so attractive, but I'm all for it because it protects the wine.
Excellent. Yeah, I was interested to see that that beautiful orange cellophane, which looks beautiful on the Cristal. It blocks 98%
Yeah.
of UV light.
Yeah.
We have to mention pyrazines. Where they smell like? Is it the bell pepper family there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Warmer climates. Are there certain wines that are more likely to suffer from them?
Right. We've moved into a whole new ocean now.
Yes, we have.
Pyrazines, there are many different types. So let's say simply that they come from the grapes to start with. What they smell like depends on the pyrazine in question. So the one we normally think of, the methoxypyrene, I'm going to abbreviate to IBMP, the MP being methoxypyrazine, and that's the one which is the bell pepper, the green, probably very highly desirable in a Sauvignon Blanc up to a level. Less desirable maybe in a red wine. But just for example, some regions actually make a thing about it. Coonawarra in Australia, their reds, their Cabernets are often very green, and something I find quite distinctive, and I quite like if someone gives me a wine to taste blind, because to pick up that greenness I always hazard a guess at Coonawarra. Sometimes right, sometimes not. But so more likely in a cool climate in that case. But there are other pyrazines that are false. So there's one, I will give this his full name, 2-isopropyl-3-methoxypyrazine. It's what gives the so-called ladybug taint in wine.
Oh.
If you get ladybirds on a cluster of grapes and they stay in during the crushing, the wine will smell of cilantro, coriander, marzipan, waxy. And there's another one, we abbreviate MDMP, they actually start tasting like fungus, and you could confuse the wine for a corked wine. But pyrazines, I say, are a world unto themselves.
Okay, cool. Now, time has flown, so I did want to, before we wrap up and we'll get your details as to where people can get your book and so on, I've had this Wine Faults kit in my basement in 3 layers of wrap because it smells so badly. So I'm unwrapping it from, oh my God, I can smell it already. The Ziploc bag, then a bubble wrap, and then finally I have it in this. Oh my God, I feel like I'm going
Don't
down
get too
into
close
those
to me. No.
bad sellers. Yeah, you can't get far enough away. I just want to show this, and we'll put a link to it in the show notes. It's the Wine Fault Aromas, and I wanted your opinion if this is a useful tool to learn about wine faults for those who do want to go in depth more or studying for a particular exam, because it has an aroma wheel, a stinky aroma wheel. Yes. And then inside, I'll just describe it for those who are listening, it has all these vials of all the smelly stuff, and a card like it's got cabbage and skunk and everything else, and you can open these vials, God forbid, and smell them to be able to better detect the aromas. Now, what do you think of something like this?
The kit is of use. Like all these things, its use is restricted by the fact, of course, you're not detecting these in a wine environment. You're detecting them in an odour environment. So they won't be quite the same. But it is of use. The one you got there is from Ney de Van.
Yes.
There is another company called Aroxa, who make aroma compounds you can use for tainting your wines with. They tend to be more expensive, but they have compounds including TDA, acetaldehyde, 4-methylphenol, that Band-Aid, etc. But I think you need to be fairly seriously investigating faults to warrant buying these.
Yeah, absolutely. I've kept it in my basement, so I haven't been that serious about it at all. But I just thought it was intriguing because at one point I was writing about faults in a highly non-scientific way, and just thought this might be useful. Anyway, I'm going to quit the rustling. So, Keith, this has been fascinating, and we clearly could have a whole course in this. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, just some personal things.
Yes.
Probably.
Absolutely.
I strongly disagree that wine should be assessed using a point scoring system. Okay. And quite often then we could have the stupid situation of a point scoring system. A wine's got a fault, but if you're accumulating your points, the fault or the level of the fault is negated by using the points. But in any event, I think we should look at wine as an art, not as a science. And if you go to see a play, if you go to see a concert, if you go to see I Love Opera, I wouldn't say that Tosca's a 99-point opera and Jonas Kaufmann was a 98-point tenor generally, but 96 points on the night. Yeah, that is absolutely crazy. You say exactly how much you enjoy it. A little trick maybe for your viewers, for those who are not viewing, you're going to have a slight problem here. My best wine gadget. Lots of people swear by various corkscrews and obviously Coravan and things like that.
Absolutely.
Here is my best wine gadget.
Okay.
Remember, I'm in England. This is a 2p coin. Or we could have a 1p coin, but you've got your nickels and dimes and you name it. You need a coin with some copper. In the manufacture. When you get a wine that smells reduced, the skunk, the garlic, the onion, put the coin in the glass of wine, swirl it round, and after a minute or so the wine will taste much less reduced. It will take a bit of the flavour out as well, it must be said.
Okay.
And just another little tip on that, if you get a wine that is badly corked, anise or tainted, and you can't send it back, you've had it in your cellar for 10 years, try getting some what we call cling wrap. I think you call saran wrap probably.
Yes.
Crunch up maybe a square metre of it into a glass of wine. Put it in there, swirl it round and round and round, and after about 3 minutes it would have taken some of that taint out of the wine. Not all of it, but some of it.
Those are fascinating tricks. I love those tips and tricks, and we'll put them all in the show notes as well. That is great, Keith. Anything else you'd like to mention before we ask where we can find you online and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, just once again, we're slightly off topic. I remember when we were doing our internet to and fro before this, you asked if I could share a bottle of wine with any person outside the wine world,
please.
Who would it be? And the person I'm going to give is probably quite a surprise. It's a composer and conductor and trumpet player called Ennio Morricone. And Ennio Morricone, Italian as you gather from the name, is perhaps most famous for writing the scores for all the spaghetti westerns, the Lee Van Cleef films, etc.
Is that the good, the bad and the ugly?
Yes, you're spot on actually.
Okay.
And what I loved about his music, he integrated classic rock, other instruments, all sorts of things, and very expressive. A lot of people say John Williams is the best movie composer. I think John Williams is much more sort of one-dimensional than Ennio Morricone. So Ennio, I was an Italian wine lover as well, and the Italians I love because they are crazy people, and at best they make some of the craziest wines in the world. At worst they make some of the most dross wines in the world as well. But the top wines are absolutely brilliant. But I want to give him a French wine to taste. Actually, would to be a Chateau Haut-Brion, but not the red wine, the white wine, Chateau Haut-Brion Blanc, which is very rare. And I tasted just a couple of years ago, actually it was at a dinner. I was lucky enough to be at Chateau Latour having a dinner, and they served the Haut-Brion Blanc. And sitting just diagonally across from me was Oz Clarke, the English wine writer, and we both picked up the glass at the same time. And this was one of those, not, oh my God, this wine is off moments, but oh my God, this is a wine of the soul moment. I've got a shiver going down my spine.
Wow.
So I think Ennio would really appreciate that.
Yes, as well he should. Yeah, that's wonderful. I love that. So Keith, your book is Wine Faults and Flaws. Where can people find it, buy it, read more about it?
Okay,
there it is.
So here we
Got
are
it.
again.
Yes.
Faults and Flaws, a practical guide. Firstly, you can, and I'm going to say don't, I'll tell you why in a minute, get it on Amazon. Okay? Now I say don't because Amazon take 55% discount from my publisher and pay me 55% less in royalties. So when they're giving you 10% discount, don't think they're doing you a favour. I've actually got nothing against Amazon because I buy a lot of stuff from them myself. My publisher is Wiley. I'm not sure if you can just about see this on the screen.
They're very much
there.
into the educational books.
They're very much into educational academic books. So their website is wiley.com. Okay,
we'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah, you can buy it on that quite easily, and it's not a cheap book, as you'll gather. I'm not even going to mention the price because I'm embarrassed. But
that's all right. It's comprehensive. It's meant to be, a significant reference.
But let's put it this way: the price of an expensive bottle of wine is more than the price of the book.
There you go. Put it in context.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. And where can we find you online, Keith?
You can find me on my own website, which as usual I never keep quite as up to date as I would wish because there's always more money making opportunities out there. So www.keithgrainger.com. That's KeithGrainger.com.
Absolutely.
And there's a
we'll link to
contact
that.
page on there. You can contact me through that. And
Okay.
always interested in people's anecdotes as well. And wines they might have tried, not sure, think, was that faulty, wasn't it faulty? Let's get an opinion. You know, so just give an example. Back to our Brett, Chateau Mouzar from Lebanon is a wine which historically built its reputation on those farmyard stable notes, you know.
Oh, wow.
And now people seek out the old bottles because
Yeah.
that's what they're looking for.
So distinctive. Yeah. I actually like it. So
Yeah.
I'm a fan of Brett. This has been wonderful. So don't log off right away, but thank you so much, Keith. We appreciate your time, your expertise, and your patience with non-scientific nerds like me. It's very helpful to have this background because it's a big part of wine and enjoying it and knowing what to avoid as well. So thank you for this.
Thank you so much and hope to talk to you again sometime and meet you soon.
Absolutely. Let's continue the
Cheers.
conversation there.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your wines.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.